Welcome to Trial Site News podcast series. We are excited to have Associate Professor Aaron Levine here with us today. Levine is a bioethicist at Georgia Tech School of Public Policy who is pioneering investigation into patient use of crowdfunding to access FDA-approved cell therapies and state-of-the-art clinical trials. So Aaron, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, the pleasure is ours. Now, before we deep dive into our topic today, we're all kinds of curious here at Trial Site News. How did you get involved in this type of project to begin with?
Thanks for the question. And it's, I guess, a bit of a long story. I'll try to keep it fairly condensed. But
Those are the best kind of stories.
I started out interested in biology long ago as an undergraduate, moved from biology to work on the Human Genome Project back in the early days of the Genome Project. This was in the 2001 timeframe. And really got excited about the ethical and policy issues that advances in biotechnology and biomedical research were posing and creating. So I moved from the Genome Project to work really on stem cells and stem cell policy and ethics. And then that's evolved over the last 15 or so years, I guess, to a whole host of questions. Today, I'm involved in a large center that's led at Georgia Tech that we call Engineering Research Center for Cell Manufacturing Technologies, or CMAT for short, and it's funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. Oh, wow. The big goal of this center is to promote technological advances, engineering advances that really allow cell therapies to reach their full potential and to make a difference in the life of patients around the world. One of my roles with the center is doing ethics and policy work, and this particular project on crowdfunding of patients participating or accessing CAR T-cell therapies was part of that role. So we got really interested in the challenges patients faced or the experiences patients had in a really exciting emerging form of cell therapy. And we're looking for different ways to learn about that experience. And ultimately, I'm doing a larger project that involves interviewing patients. Mm-hmm. And before we got into that, we wanted to learn as much as we could about the patient experience from existing sources or sources that were already out there in the world. And one of those sources that we came across were these crowdfunding campaigns. And so obviously not every patient will have a crowdfunding campaign, but a lot of patients do. And we can learn about some of the challenges they face, some of the decisions they make, and other things from reading these crowdfunding campaigns and exploring them. So that was sort of the origins of this project.
Oh, wow. Well, that's amazing. Now, we truly appreciated your study on the various CAR T crowdfunding campaigns, and we felt it was intelligent, innovative, and frankly pragmatic, given the significant advancements in cancer therapies, such as the various precision-based immuno-oncology therapies, like CAR T therapy, etc. Now, generally, is it your understanding that as drug companies commercialize these, there is a strategy for mass access?
So I think that's a good question. Companies are certainly thinking about access as they develop new therapy. But I think they're thinking about the commercialization and ultimately their access plan based on the size of market they anticipate. CAR T is probably a special case. The initial indications for CAR T cell therapy, such as relapsed or refractory pediatric ALL, are very small, hundreds of patients a year. But the future markets are potentially much larger. So as a company thinks about developing a CAR T cell therapy, they're thinking initially about access when they're providing tens, hundreds, maybe a little more than that in terms of doses per year. But in the back of their mind and their longer term strategy, they need to be thinking about a time when there could be not just hundreds, but thousands or tens of thousands of patients receiving CAR T cell therapy a year. And that poses very serious access issues, thinking about the costs, some of the logistics of these treatments. It also, frankly, poses very serious manufacturing issues in terms of, can we actually produce enough of these therapies quickly enough to get them to patients who need them? And I think over the next decade, as CAR T cell therapy expands and reaches out to new indications, moves from last resort potentially to perhaps second-line therapy for some cancers, we really are going to face some very serious growing pains in the industry as the facilities get large enough, as the production processes, manufacturing processes get efficient enough to meet the demand of the patients around the world.
Gotcha. Now, what kind of feedback have you received on this important study? Can you summarize any themes or patterns in terms of response, like, say, from sponsors, payers, and providers?
It's a good question, and it's interesting. We don't usually get a lot of immediate feedback from academic studies. It sort of comes slowly through future papers and responses and so on. And this one has been a little bit unusual, particularly in responses from the patient community. And by that, I mean sort of the broader community of patient advocacy groups, organizations working with clinical trial sites, that sort of thing. And there has been a pretty consistent theme of feedback there that I would say has been, I'm not sure the best word, perhaps almost grateful for shining a light on the reality that patients participating in clinical trials are still experiencing financial hardship, and many of them need to find additional sources of funding. I feel like, from my perspective, that was one of the more interesting and important points to come out of the paper. But I heard from several groups that said, one, it's important to make sure people are aware of this. But two, the other thing that I heard was that there are a lot of different resources out there to help with this. So some hospitals will have specific resources, for instance, to help people with lodging or to help people with travel. Sometimes it's the patient advocacy groups that might say, well, we have small pools of funding to, essentially give mini grants to help people gain access to these sorts of therapies. So on the one hand, I think there was this appreciation that, hey, we can shine a light on this and maybe that will allow more systemic change. I think in the long term, that's important, but also in the short term that there could be more awareness of some of these resources that are out there to help patients with it as well. So I thought those were sort of the two main themes that I've heard.
Well, and do you think social media is playing a role in that? When you look at, especially with crowdfunding, and I see a lot of that on different social media platforms, the people, they glom onto it. Folks want to care, and so they want to participate and that sort of thing. Do you think that might have played a role?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you write about social media, the sort of discussion of it on social media is a sort of natural thing to expect, and right. So
yeah,
but I think there's been a lot of attention to medical crowdfunding over the last, say, 5 or so years for a whole range of different aspects of it. And I think there's been a fair bit of discussion on social media and transferring into policy circles and hopefully, some of the organizers of these sites, some of the companies that sponsor or permit crowdfunding, and perhaps some of the drug sponsors as well. I haven't been, brought into those conversations necessarily, but I do think you can see a lot of conversation online about, is this something that is good or is it bad? Is it something we want to encourage? Is this something we ought to take action about? Either, sort of private action, can people, take steps individually or as private firms to address some of the challenges with crowdfunding, or is this a role for government actors, whether it's FDA or FTC or some other agency getting involved in thinking about how medical crowdfunding is playing out and the potential benefits and frankly some of the potential harms for patients as well.
Right. And on that note, so after following your study, we started to feel like it was becoming normalized for patients to launch crowdfunding campaigns to help save a family member with cancer. And based on what you were just saying and on your research, do you believe that this is starting to become the new norm? And do you think this is a good thing?
Well, two different questions. Let me start with, is it becoming a new norm? And first, a caveat. I mean, my study focused on CAR T-cell therapy. So this is a small personalized therapy, small patient population at this point. So I don't think I can say based on my research, specifically, that crowdfunding is becoming a norm, right? For patients pursuing CAR T-cell therapy, which is a specialized, expensive therapy, my work suggests that a pretty decent group of these patients, either accessing clinical trials or accessing approved therapies, are creating crowdfunding sites or having someone create one on their behalf. Whether that generalizes to cancer therapy broadly, I can't say. But I would say that we know, and there's a lot of literature on this, that cancer care is extremely expensive and creates very serious financial hardship, even for patients with very good health insurance coverage, right? There's a growing literature on what we call financial toxicity of cancer.
Yeah.
And, all this data on medically induced bankruptcies, all of these things reflect challenges in our healthcare system combined with the really high cost of care. So I would suspect that this is quite common. A lot of patients are creating crowdfunding sites or having family members or friends do this for them. And part of this is the reality is a cancer diagnosis is typically a very long-term diagnosis. Even with good treatment, the treatment takes time, the follow-up takes time, the cancer might come back, and so on and so forth. So having these sorts of sites, I think, will become increasingly common. Whether it's a norm at this point, I don't think I can say for sure.
Right. And how do you feel about its, it as a positive or negative?
I have mixed feelings about the growth of crowdfunding. On the one hand, it does provide an avenue for some patients to raise funds they really need and to access care that they might struggle to access in other ways, right? So if it is an approved therapy or a legitimate clinical trial, and the patient could not possibly access the trial or the treatment in any other way, I think there is a benefit to that crowdfunding campaign. But that is that's weighed against by a lot of downsides of medical crowdfunding. And so, as a overall, I have mixed views, right? So there's been, let me just expound, I guess, on some of the challenges of crowdfunding, right? Crowdfunding creates a real privacy issue. Right? So patients are encouraged to share very private details of their medical history, their medical condition.
Right.
That's the very nature of these crowdfunding campaigns. The more details you share, the more specific you are, the more pictures you include. All of this increases the likelihood that you'll be successful, right? So you might really value your privacy, but you feel like you need this funding and you have to compromise this policy. So that's a real ethical dilemma and a real problem, I would say. There's also a second challenge, and this is not something I've studied specifically, but others have examined, and that's that the nature of who develops successful crowdfunding campaigns. So one thing we know is that crowdfunding campaigns are very skewed in their distribution of how much money they raise. Some campaigns essentially go viral, generate tons and tons of attention and lots of funding. And a lot of crowdfunding campaigns sit there with a handful of donations, generate a little bit of money, but really probably not enough to meet the patient needs and can't be considered a success.
Right.
And so one of the themes that's emerging in the crowdfunding literature, particularly in the context of medical crowdfunding, is that this is not a random distribution. It's not just, here's patient 1, here's patient 2, here's patient 3, and so on, and then flip a coin, roll a die, and choose which one is going to be the successful campaign. But rather that success is really associated with other characteristics of the patient, the patient's family, the patient's social network, and so on, right? So it turns out, in there's a decent amount of evidence now that people who are more connected, whether that's connected already online or broadly connected in sort of a social network in, let's say, the real world, the offline world, right, they tend to be the people who do a little bit better on these campaigns, right? So if I ran a campaign, for instance, and I happen to have spent time talking to journalists in the Atlanta area, I might, could have been totally unrelated to the need for the campaign, could have been for work or whatever. I might have more access to that population. I might be able to get a newspaper reporter or a radio reporter to say something about my campaign on the air or in a paper, right? And suddenly it goes from the tens of people I shared it with initially to thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in a single mention, right? And you can see how some campaigns just get much more access than others.
Absolutely.
And there's a real concern that that's correlated, at least in part, with socioeconomic status. So you might have this unfortunate situation where the people who are most successful at crowdfunding campaigns are not really the people who have the greatest need for this funding. All else equal, you'd rather someone who's struggling to raise money have the at least as good, if not better, chance to raise money via crowdfunding, but it might be sort of the opposite, right? So there's some equity issues there, I would say, as well.
Right. And so touching on that, does this raise real ethical issues about our healthcare system?
Yeah, so I think my study particularly and the growth of crowdfunding for healthcare more generally raised some ethical issues. And so let me break those into two areas.
Okay.
One, I think there's a set of ethical issues associated with clinical trials. So when a patient participates in a clinical trial, they are receiving experimental therapy to generate knowledge, not necessarily to provide a direct medical benefit. They may get a direct medical benefit in some cases, but that's not necessarily the way a trial is structured. The patient may face unknown, poorly characterized risks, and so patients are really contributing to knowledge, contributing to society when they enroll in a trial, right? And so from an ethical perspective, I really think we should try to avoid asking patients to incur serious expenses to participate in these trials. the sponsor of the trial, whether it's a pharmaceutical company, an academic medical center, should try to find ways to minimize the costs as much as possible. And I think there is a long norm in this. So patients in clinical trials, research participants in clinical trials rarely pay for the treatment itself. But what our study showed, was that there's a lot of other costs that these patients are getting stuck with. And so in the case of CAR T cell therapy in particular, there's often travel. It's a long-term treatment, so you need to be on site or near the site of treatment for an extended period of time. So you're missing work if you're a working adult. You need housing in addition to your, mortgage payment or rental payment back at home. And so there's a whole host of other costs that you might consider an indirect cost of participation. And there's a mixture, I think, in our system of how well those are covered by this drug sponsors, the drug companies, the academic medical centers, and others. There are certainly cases where that is covered, but there's a lot of cases where it's not. And I think that is ethically problematic. And so that's one set of issues, right? The CAR T clinical trials are perhaps an atypical case. We usually actually worry in clinical trials that the patients are sort of disadvantaged by participating, or that people are taking on excess risk to gain access to an experimental treatment, and undergoing risk with maybe a little prospect of benefit, particularly in an early stage trial. The CAR T case is a little bit, not quite the opposite, but certainly a little different, because the early trials have just been so phenomenally successful. The nature of the therapy is that, if it works, the dose you get in a phase 1 trial might be very close to the final dose and might be curative, since the genetically engineered T cells each one can kill thousands of these cancer cells, right? So you don't need a huge dose necessarily to work. And so you actually get this situation where, rather than worrying that people are being sort of forced into these trials as a desperate last chance at healthcare, you can imagine that people are clamoring to get in these trials. And so it does flip the ethical dimensions on its head a little bit. And I actually sometimes worry that there's bias again towards the sort of well-off elite in terms of who can get these trials, who can access an early stage CAR T cell therapy. And we know that this is compounded because these aren't the kind of trials where there's enough of the treatment to go around to treat everybody, right? At least early on, sort of, we're going to take one patient this month, and then in a couple months we'll take another patient because that's as fast as we can manufacture the cells. It's changed a little bit over the last few years, right? But you can imagine that the person who has the resources to show up at Penn or Seattle Children's or wherever it is with their child in 2 days might be advantaged over the person who doesn't, right? So there's a set of interesting ethical issues about access to these clinical trials as well.
Right.
That crowdfunding highlights, I think, in an interesting way. But so the question you asked was really about crowdfunding in the healthcare system. And I do think the growth of medical crowdfunding broadly, not just for clinical trials, but for approved care, for coinsurance, for copays, for all of these things is really quite a strong indictment of our larger medical system. And I'm talking particularly about the U.S. context here.
Right.
We know lots of people in the United States are uninsured, probably even more underinsured. And seeing how commonly people turn to crowdfunding really points this out, I think, in a very visible, very public manner. Right? And so I think we can see this as saying that there really is something not working about our healthcare system if so many people, and GoFundMe will tell you that medical campaigns is the single largest section of their portfolio of crowdfunding campaigns.
Absolutely.
If so many people need to turn to this and similar sites to cover what ought to be, in a lot of cases, fairly basic healthcare that really everyone should have. So I think we can see it as highlighting ethical issues, highlighting shortcomings in our healthcare system that we really ought to address.
Agreed. We take a pause for a moment with some minor audio technical difficulties, and now we'd like to welcome back Aaron Levine to the show. So Aaron, welcome back.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. He's here with us on the phone, and the audio sounds great. our questions here. You have a recent study about the lengths patients need to go to, and we just touched on this, to secure funding in advance for personalized medicines. Can you explain a bit more, based on your study results, about what these lengths are and how they impact the speed of care the patient can obtain?
Sure. So what we did was looked at GoFundMe, which I said was the largest crowdfunding website out there and a site that does a lot of medical campaigns. And we looked through their campaigns for crowdfunding campaigns that were specifically about CAR T-cell therapy. And in this particular study, we looked at around 150 campaigns that were active late last fall, so October, November 2018 timeframe. And then we read all of these campaigns in detail to understand why patients started crowdfunding campaigns or why their friends or family started them on their behalf, and to try to get a window into the challenges that these patients faced paying for either the therapy itself or the sort of costs associated with the therapy. And there's a number of things that we discovered, right? One is that we've already talked about a little bit. Some of these patients were running crowdfunding campaigns to help access ongoing CAR T-cell therapy clinical trials. So perhaps they were trying to participate in the clinical trial and they had some additional costs that weren't covered by the sponsor. So that was one fairly typical profile. And then a second profile was a patient that was trying to access CAR T-cell therapy on the market, if you will. So following FDA approval of the first two CAR T-cell therapies, these were patients who were saying, either my health insurance doesn't cover this in a few cases, perhaps I'm coming from a jurisdiction that doesn't provide coverage for these particular treatments, or my health insurance just leaves me with a lot of other uncovered expenses, and I need to raise funding to help support my effort, my access to these innovative therapies, right? So those were sorts of the sort of patient profiles we observed. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, we then read through each campaign and tried to essentially code the reasons that were articulated for that campaign to exist, really, the reasons that the patient was fundraising or whoever started the campaign was fundraising. And, this sort of goes along with what I was just saying, but patients were raising money for a lot of different reasons. The single most common was what we coded as medical costs, right? But this was a fairly broad category that could include everything from I, as a patient, am on the hook for the full cost of this therapy, which can be as much as $500,000, to, my insurance is covering this, but I need, to pay fairly substantial copays. I have a high deductible, these sorts of things, and I need to contribute to that, right? So this is a very broad category that had, I'd say, a lot of heterogeneity within the reasons people were crowdfunding, right? What I ultimately thought were the sort of most interesting categories from a sort of ethics perspective, maybe from a health policy perspective as well, was what I would call indirect costs. So these are patients who turn to crowdfunding to support, for instance, travel to the site of the therapy. And so this could be both in clinical trials, right? The clinical trials only happen at a small number of academic medical centers, or it could be for an approved therapy, because the reality is the CAR T-cell treatment is so specialized that even today, more than 2 years after the initial approvals, it's still only available at a relatively small number of academic medical centers, some of which have a lot more experience than others. So patients might really want to be treated at, say, Penn, where a lot of this was developed, and be willing to travel there for the perception of getting more experienced medical staff and that sort of thing. Right. So the travel could be airfare, that sort of thing. It might also be the need to cover lodging over an extended period of time, or it might be the need to essentially make up from lost pay for missing work. And so this could be a patient who missed work, him or herself, or it could be a parent who was away from work caring for their minor child. Remember, one of the first two indications for which CAR T-cell therapy was approved was pediatric leukemia. So a lot of early patients were minors, and then their parents were accompanying them to these treatments. The challenge of crowdfunding, and we talked a little bit about this, the challenge of crowdfunding as a sort of health policy analysis is that we don't know exactly what happens to these patients. The crowdfunding campaigns were captured as a sort of snapshot. We haven't gone back and systematically followed up to see if patients have updated them. And indeed, not all patients do, right? So we don't really know what happened to every one of these patients. Did they get the medicine? In some cases, almost certainly yes. In some cases, they talk about the treatment. In some cases, perhaps not, right? And I don't have a good breakdown on that. Ultimately would suspect, my best guess, if you will, would be that it's a mix. Some patients raised enough money either through crowdfunding or through other sources, right, to pursue the treatment, to receive the treatment, whether it was a clinical trial or directly on the market. And some probably didn't and either were unable to receive the treatment, got too sick and were no longer eligible, that sort of thing, right? So it's a little hard to know precisely. I think we should point out, right, crowdfunding is probably one in a portfolio, essentially, of fundraising strategies that patients are using. If you're, in the situation, a really, frankly, quite sad situation where you desperately need to raise a large sum of money for a potentially life-saving treatment, but are struggling to do so, you're probably going to try almost anything, right? So you might be exploring, a second mortgage on your house. You might be talking about borrowing from friends or family. You might be having sort of the old-fashioned form of crowdfunding, which is, bake sales and church fundraisers and these sorts of things, and running a crowdfunding campaign as well. And, in some cases that might all come together with enough funding to access the treatment. In other cases, it might not.
That makes sense. Which, I guess then when talking about crowdfunding and has it been successful for patients as a whole, like you were saying, it's a mixed bag. So how does this affect those patients who are underserved and may not have access to social media at any time?
Yeah, so that's I think an important question, right? We know that internet access is not universal, and then even among individuals with internet access, social media skills, social media savvy, if you will, is also not universal or evenly distributed. So I think this goes back to some of our earlier conversation. Some people are going to be better at running these campaigns than others. And part of that might be they're already well connected, they have access to big networks. Part of it might be that they grew up in this digital world, they work in communications, a whole sorts of other things that might, sort of support a strong and successful campaign. Right? The narrative might be compelling, the pictures might draw people back in, right? All sorts of ways that you can essentially think of a crowdfunding campaign as a marketing site, and you're requesting donations, right? So the more interesting your campaign is, the more compelling content, the more likely someone might be to donate or to donate more or to share. And so I think this does raise questions about sort of the fairness of this and whether, it's really a good solution for everybody. And frankly, I think the answer is no. I think, there's problems with it as a solution generally, and those problems are exacerbated for populations of patients who are underserved, who have limited internet access or, limited skills with these sorts of tools, right? So I think there are some real challenges there.
Right. And so what is some advice you would give to clinicians about helping the patients with, say, funding or information about funding for personalized medicine?
So I think the first and perhaps most important thing is that clinicians really need to be aware of the costs some of these treatments are imposing on their patients. Right? There's a lot of excitement, I think, in some cases. We have a really exciting, exciting treatment with really a lot of potential for your condition. And remember, a lot of these patients are very much last resort patients who, if they didn't qualify for CAR-T, might have really no or few options, right? So, I think that excitement is fine, right? We have something that we can offer you that has really helped other patients. But remember that, we need to think carefully about the funding of this, how we're going to help you figure out how to access the resources you need to make this work, right? So making sure it's structured in a way that your insurance is covering as much of it as possible, making sure that you're, as a patient, aware of all the other resources out there to help you. So rather than finding out, after the fact that you could have actually gotten subsidized housing from the hospital or from the relevant patient advocacy organization for your condition. Make sure people know that in advance. And I think that there's probably some heterogeneity among this. I was talking to a patient not that long ago who said that the information, the quality of information that was provided by the hospitals about the sort of local environment, what the opportunities were for finding places to stay, for finding food, all of these things that can be real meaningful costs for patients, varied a lot, with some hospitals really prepared to, this is what we have to offer you, make sure you pursue these things in advance, and others being a little less prepared with that sort of information, right? So I think the clinician, ultimately their responsibility is to provide the best care for their patients, right? But being aware of the funding challenges and aware of the possibilities is I think, really a critical responsibility for clinicians as well, right? And so the other follow-up is crowdfunding. Should a clinician mention crowdfunding, talk about crowdfunding, suggest crowdfunding? I think the verdict is still out on this. There's been some really interesting discussions I've heard about, do clinicians have an obligation to point this out as a possibility? Do they have an obligation to sort of not tell their patients about it because it might be problematic in some ways? So I think it's unresolved in the sort of medical ethics, medical professionalism literature. But I do think it raises some interesting questions. And I mean, I think it's naive to think in most cases that patients won't be aware of the possibility of crowdfunding or won't come across it fairly quickly, right? So I don't think there's a lot of value in saying, oh, I'm not going to mention this at all. I think there may be some more value in a discussion about medical crowdfunding, about some of the pros and cons, and about some of the reasons patients have used it, right? So if you have a patient that is in this situation, I don't think there's a harm in saying medical crowdfunding is a tool that some patients have used to help meet these costs, right? But it's not a panacea. It doesn't yield tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars for everybody or even for most people, right? And our data shows in CAR-T that the median campaign was raising somewhere on the order of $4,000 to $5,000 at the time we took our snapshot, right? So this is not the hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars that you hear about in some media coverage of this, right? But it can raise real money, and that it can be helpful, right? And then there's this sort of outside chance of being one of that tail of campaigns that really does raise hundreds of thousands to millions. And we all hear about those because they're great stories. I think the physician should be discouraging that. The clinician is not or should not be in the role of saying, well, if you hit the jackpot, right, you can have the viral campaign and cover all of your expenses. That's not really the responsible way to talk about this. But, a crowdfunding campaign can, I think, help patients raise some of the funding they need to pursue care, to access care, and to hopefully receive treatment that helps them get better.
Right. Now, you were mentioning, obviously, some hospitals are better at being upfront with their patients. But what would be the best advice you would give patients about funding for personalized medicine then? And are there questions that they should be asking?
Certainly. So, I think patients, it's a difficult situation, particularly when you're at the state where you're considering a CAR T-cell therapy for a last resort leukemia or lymphoma, right? You're looking for anything and sort of worrying about the cost later, I think is sort of the typical patient experience. Right? But on one hand, that's totally understandable, right? It's about getting the treatment, hopefully getting better. But I do think that patients should try to be aware of costs and ask questions about those costs, and particularly ask questions about the resources that may be available to them, the opportunities that may be available to them to reduce costs if possible. Because before the treatment is often the opportunity to do this, right? It might be the opportunity to learn that actually the hospital will provide housing if you indicate you need it. And as we've talked about, this is one of the challenges with CAR T-cell therapy. Both in clinical trials and actually for the approved therapy, patients are supposed to stay near the site of treatment for an extended period of time afterwards. And there's good reason for this. It has to do with some of the very serious side effects. But not being able to go home if you live, more than a couple hours away from the hospital is a very serious expense. And it's an expense that there are some hospitals that are able to help with. They have extended stay facilities. They have access to charity that can help with that. But if you don't ask, you'll never know. So I think, patients certainly should be excited about the therapy, certainly, should move forward with receiving it if it's indicated for them, right? But should explore the resources that are available to help minimize the cost. And the other big thing, and this is not about crowdfunding directly, but I think connects to it, is that there are really good patient organizations, or not even patient organizations, just groups of patients online today that have been enabled by the growth of social media, Facebook and others, right? And I think it's really important for patients to engage with these groups and to learn from other patients. And in almost all cases, a patient is not the first person with this specific situation, not this first person who struggled with funding for this specific treatment,
right,
with the cost of this specific clinical trial. And learning from the experience of others can be really valuable. And, not everyone is out there spending their time offering advice, but the nature of these patient groups is that the people who engage with them have essentially self-selected for an interest in that and a willingness to help out. And so I think that is a missed resource for patients if they don't realize early on that, I'm thinking about a CAR T-cell therapy. There are a number of patient groups out there that can help me navigate this process, whether it's telling me, what to expect as I go to the hospital or how to think about the costs that might come up, right? And so I think patients should explore those. And indeed, going back to your previous question, I think there's good reason for physicians to make sure their patients are aware of these. And, that might be a more controversial statement in some cases because physicians sometimes like to control the information flow to their patients. But I don't think that's really the right choice here. I think there's a lot that a patient can learn from other patients' experiences. And I think in most cases, we ought to be embracing that.
I agree. And you make a really good point about groups that are gathering together for specific issues. That is a big deal. And it will not just help them, find financial options, but, emotional support, which is also important as well. So do you think this is a permanent fixture in our future? A loved one gets cancer, and if the insurance company doesn't cover a decent portion, then there's a scramble to raise funding via family, friends, and even strangers. Do you think that's where we're going to be permanently?
That's a tough question. I don't know the answer. I would like to think that we're on an upward trajectory with our healthcare system, that things will improve over time, and that fewer patients will be forced to scramble for healthcare that I personally think ought to be provided to patients through some sort of improved insurance system. I do think realistically in the U.S. context, that's a long-term project, and long-term, I mean quite seriously, right? This is not a few years.
Right.
This is much beyond that. And it's a political question as much of anything, thinking about, both a political and an economic question, right? The healthcare system is a big part of our economy. The healthcare system is a huge focus of our elected officials, particularly at the national level, a big focus of the presidential campaign. I think regardless of the election, though, it's a long time till we see dramatic improvements in our healthcare system. But I would like to think we're moving towards a system that is better for patients, and that we don't have to think everyone needs a crowdfunding campaign to cover their healthcare costs. I really don't want crowdfunding to become a replacement for health insurance. I don't think that is appropriate from a policy view, from an ethical view, for really any perspective.
Absolutely.
But that said, I don't think medical crowdfunding is going away. So I think we will have it for quite a while. Which direction we go in the near term and then over the long term, I think is still an open question. I have to say I'm probably fairly pessimistic about dramatic improvements over the short term in the sort of healthcare system itself. But over the long term, I think there's reason to be somewhat optimistic that our healthcare system can be structured in a way that is fairer to patients, provides better coverage, and that sort of thing.
I think you're probably right there. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today, Levine. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, no problem. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, no, ours as well, and it's been enlightening to be able to talk with you about all this. Now, for those of you in the audience interested in learning more, you can visit our website, and you can read the story, which we'll link articles to, and the links will also be provided in the description below. You can also find Trial Site News on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and the links will be provided in the description below as well. So thank you for joining us today, and we really appreciate you spending your time with us here.
No problem. Thanks.
All right, thank you.